The groan of the locomotive was a sound of finality, a long, metallic sigh that surrendered to the vast, waiting silence of the Montana Territory. Steam hissed from the iron beast, misting the air for a moment before the thirsty heat swallowed it whole. From the passenger car, Abigail May Hollis descended the steep steps, her hand gripping the worn handle of her trunk as if it were an anchor in an unfamiliar sea. She set it down on the warped planks of the platform and stood straight, a small, determined figure against the immense, sun-bleached landscape. It was the late afternoon of a day in the last stretch of the 1880s, and the season was one of thirst. A long dry spell had cracked the earth and leached the color from the grasses, turning the rolling plains to a pale, brittle gold. The wind, a constant, tireless presence, swept across the land, carrying with it a fine grit that settled on everything, coating her dark traveling dress and the lashes around her blue eyes. It soughed through the eaves of the station house and toyed with the sign that hung from 2 chains, making it creak a rhythmic, lonely complaint, Willow Ridge. Abigail clutched the letter in her pocket. The paper was soft from countless readings, the ink a faded promise. It was signed by a man named Evan Calder, a name that had become the cornerstone of her future. He was a young rancher, his words full of hope for a shared life, a partnership against the wildness of this new country. He had paid her passage through the Western Matrimonials Agency, and she had sent him what little dowry she possessed, the savings of a lifetime spent as an orphan and a seamstress. Here, in Willow Ridge, her real life was meant to begin, a life of her own making, built on the foundation of a man's word. Her gaze swept the length of the town's main street, a single, wide artery of packed dirt. It was a place of stark utility. False-fronted buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, a general store, a saloon whose swinging doors offered glimpses of a shadowed interior, a post office, and a sheriff's office with a single barred window. Further down, a white church lifted its modest steeple toward the endless sky, looking severe and out of place in the dust. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a rain that never came. A man was loading spools of barbed wire onto a buckboard wagon near the freight office. He worked with a steady, unhurried economy of motion that spoke of strength held in reserve. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind to the color of worn leather. He wore a plain shirt and denim trousers, practical clothes for a working man. Abigail noticed the set of his jaw, the quiet competence in his hands. He did not seem the sort to waste words or actions. He glanced her way once, a brief, assessing look from eyes the color of a stormy sky, then returned to his task. He was just another face in a town of strangers, yet something about his stillness registered, a point of calm in the swirling dust. This was Jonah Flint, owner of the Willow Creek Ranch, a man whose reputation for keeping his word was as solid as the granite hills that bordered his land. He was a widower of 2 years, his life pared down to the hard truths of cattle, land, and the relentless turning of the seasons. He had come to town for supplies, not to witness the arrival of another hopeful mail-order bride. Still, he saw her. He saw the way she stood, her back straight as a fence post, her chin slightly lifted, a woman bracing for a future she could only imagine. He had seen that look before, in the faces of young troopers heading into their first skirmish, a fragile armor of hope against an unknown enemy. Abigail's eyes searched the thinning crowd. A few cowboys, their faces masked by trail dust, tipped their hats as they passed, their spurs making a soft, jingling music on the boardwalk. A woman with a basket on her arm hurried by, her face pinched with worry, likely over the price of flour or the ever-present threat of sickness. Through the window of the saloon, she saw a large man with a florid face, Barlow Finch, the territory's most powerful cattle broker, sealing a deal with a handshake that looked more like a threat. On the opposite side of the street, the town's preacher, Deacon Abel Crow, walked with a rigid, self-righteous gait, his gaze sweeping over the dusty street as if searching for sin. He paused, his eyes landing on Abigail, and his thin lips tightened in a line of silent judgment. She felt the weight of his stare like a physical touch, cold and unwelcome. The station master came out, rolling a cigarette. "That's all for today, miss," he said, his voice raspy. "Train's moving on." Abigail's heart gave a small, anxious flutter. "I am waiting for Mr. Evan Calder." She kept her voice even, betraying none of the uncertainty that was beginning to seed itself in her mind. The man shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference. "Don't know him. If he said he'd be here, I reckon he'll be here. Or he won't." He lit his cigarette and ambled back into his office, leaving her alone with the creaking sign and the ceaseless wind. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The heat of the day began to recede, replaced by the creeping chill of a Montana evening. The shadows of the building stretched long and distorted across the street. Abigail pulled her shawl tighter. The hope that had sustained her across 1,000 miles of rattling track was beginning to feel thin and brittle, as fragile as a dried leaf. She took the letter from her pocket, unfolding it to read the familiar words one more time, as if the ink itself could offer reassurance. Jonah Flint had finished his work. His wagon was loaded, the knots on the rope securing his cargo firm and true. He lingered for a moment, watching the woman on the platform. She was still there, a solitary figure now, looking small and terribly alone. It was not his business. The West was full of broken promises and foolish dreams. He had his own ranch to run, his own ghosts to keep. Yet, he could not bring himself to leave. There was a stubbornness in her posture that he recognized, a refusal to bend that resonated with something deep inside him. It was the same quality that allowed a lone cottonwood to survive by a dry creek bed, its roots digging deep for a water that others could not find. The landscape itself was a testament to that same unyielding spirit. The Willow River, which gave the town its name, was little more than a whisper of its spring self. Its waters ran shallow over a bed of smooth, white stones, bleached by the sun. It was a hard, spare beauty, a land that offered no false comfort. It promised nothing but what it was: rock, dust, and a sky so vast it could make a person's soul feel small. But it was an honest land. It did not pretend to be soft or forgiving. It demanded strength, and in return, it offered a stark, clean reality. Abigail looked out over that parched landscape and felt not fear, but a sense of recognition. She understood hard things. She had been raised on them. A raw-boned cowboy with a mean squint in his eyes, a man Jonah knew as Hawk Roper, swaggered out of the saloon. He noticed Abigail and made a crude comment to his companion, his laughter a harsh, ugly sound that carried on the wind. Abigail heard it, and though a flush of color rose in her cheeks, she did not flinch. She simply folded her letter, tucked it back into her pocket, and placed her hand on the lid of her trunk. A quiet act of possession, of claiming her small space in this unwelcoming world. From his wagon, Jonah's hand tightened on the reins. He knew men like Roper. They preyed on the vulnerable, mistaking quietness for weakness. He felt a low, protective anger stir within him, an old instinct from his cavalry days. But the woman did not look weak. She looked like she was waiting for a battle, and she had no intention of retreating. The themes that would define her new life were already being sown in the dusty air of Willow Ridge. The honor of a name, the weight of a promise, the casual cruelty of a community's judgment. She had come seeking a family, a place to belong, but she was learning that, in this place, a family might not be something you were given, but something you had to build, piece by piece, with your own 2 hands. The last of the daylight bled from the sky, and the first stars pricked the deep. Velvety darkness. The town was quieting down, the lamps in the windows casting warm, isolated pools of light. Still, Abigail waited. Her hope had dwindled to a tiny, stubborn ember, but it was not yet extinguished. She had come too far to let it die now. She stood her ground on the empty platform of Willow Ridge, a seamstress with a battered trunk, a fading letter, and a spirit as resilient and unyielding as the harsh, honest land that stretched out before her. The sound that finally broke the stillness was not the one she had been waiting for. It was not the confident stride of a young rancher coming to claim his bride, but the heavy, uncertain scrape of worn-out boot heels on wood. A man emerged from the deep shadows of the freight building, weaving slightly as he walked. He was stout, with a belly that strained the buttons of his grimy shirt, and the stale, sweet smell of whiskey preceded him like a foul announcement. He stopped a few feet from her, peering at her through the gloom. "You, the woman for Calder," he slurred, his voice a low rumble. Abigail's hand tightened on the handle of her trunk. This was not Evan. This was not the man from the letters. The man whose carefully formed words had painted a picture of a decent and hard-working life. "I am Miss Hollis," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am expecting Mr. Evan Calder." The man let out a short, unpleasant laugh. "Well, he ain't expecting you. Not anymore." He fumbled inside his coat and produced a creased, dirty envelope. He held it out to her. "He sent this, and there is a fee for my trouble. For the delivery." A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through Abigail's composure. She took the letter, her fingers brushing against his. His hand was damp and rough. She ignored his demand for money. Her attention fixed on the envelope. It was not addressed in Evan's hand. The scrawl was clumsy, barely legible. She turned it over and broke the seal. She moved closer to the single lamp hanging from the station eave, its yellow light a small circle of clarity in the growing darkness. The letter inside was short, the message brutal in its simplicity. "Miss Hollis, circumstances have changed. I have gone to Wyoming on business. Our arrangement is hereby concluded. The funds you sent via Western Matrimonials will cover my expenses. Do not attempt to contact me, E. Calder." The words swam before her eyes. Wyoming. Concluded. "The funds will cover my expenses." The dry, rustling paper seemed to mock her, a testament to a betrayal so complete and impersonal it stole her breath. It was not a change of heart. It was a transaction, a theft. She had been purchased and discarded like a sack of feed. "The fee," the man insisted, his voice louder now, impatient. $1 for my time." From the saloon across the street, a few figures had spilled out onto the boardwalk, drawn by the exchange. Hawk Roper was among them, his face lit by a malicious grin. "What is the matter?" Friend Roper called out. "Did the mail-order bride arrive with postage due?" The foreman, emboldened by his audience, puffed out his chest. "She is used goods, is what she is." Calder took her money and lit out. "Smart man. Why buy the cow when you have already drunk the milk for free?" The laughter that followed was coarse and loud. Abigail felt the heat of 100 invisible eyes on her. Each laugh, each jeering comment, was a physical blow. Her reputation, the only currency a woman in her position truly possessed, was being stripped from her before she had even spent a night in this town. Deacon Crow, who had been making his way home, paused on the far side of the street. He did not join the laughter, but his expression was one of solemn, vindictive satisfaction. He cleared his throat, and his voice, though not loud, carried with the chilling authority of the pulpit. "The wages of a hasty and unblessed union are often paid in shame," he intoned, looking directly at Abigail. "A woman without the proper moral anchor is a ship lost in the storm." The foreman, now playing fully to the crowd, took a step closer to her. "Pay me my $1, or I will take it from your luggage." From his wagon, Jonah Flint watched it all unfold. He had seen the woman read the letter, had seen the slight, almost imperceptible stiffening of her spine as the meaning of the words sank in. He watched her face in the lamplight, expecting to see tears, a crumble of despair. He saw neither. Her expression was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Her eyes, which had seemed a gentle blue in the daylight, now looked like chips of ice. She did not cry. She did not scream. She stood her ground, a small island in a sea of contempt. Jonah's respect for her, a nascent, unexamined thing, hardened into something solid. He had seen men break under less pressure. Abigail lifted her head, her gaze sweeping over the leering faces of the cowboys, past the smug pronouncements of the deacon, and landed on the drunken foreman. "I will not pay you a single cent," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You are a party to a crime. Now get out of my sight before I find the sheriff and have you charged with theft and intimidation." The foreman blinked, taken aback by her tone. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, but the jeers of the crowd pushed him forward. "Theft? You are the one who is trying to cheat me." Before he could take another step, a new figure appeared. Sheriff Judd was a man past his prime, with a weary face and a drooping mustache. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had seen too much trouble to ever be in a hurry. "That is enough. Silas," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "Leave the lady alone." The foreman, Silas, grumbled but backed away, melting back into the shadows from which he came. The crowd, deprived of its sport, began to disperse. Sheriff Judd turned to Abigail, his expression not unkind, but deeply tired. "Ma'am," he began, "I am sorry for your trouble, but there is nothing I can do for you here. This business with the matrimonial agency, it is a civil matter. And as for Calder, he is likely halfway to Wyoming by now. My advice to you is to take the morning train back east. This is no town for a woman alone and without prospects." "I have no money for a ticket," Abigail stated, the words tasting like ash. "My savings were sent to Mr. Calder." The sheriff sighed. A long, drawn-out sound. "Then I suggest you find some other way. Willow Ridge is a hard place. It will chew up and spit out anyone who does not have a foothold. You should be gone before nightfall." He tipped his hat and walked away. His duty, as he saw it, done. Gone before nightfall? The words echoed in the silence. But where was she to go? Her first stop was the town's only boarding house, a grim, two-story building run by a widow with a face like a clenched fist. Abigail knocked, and the woman opened the door a crack. "I need a room for the night," Abigail said. The woman's eyes raked over her, taking in her simple dress, her solitary trunk, the absence of a male companion. The story from the station had clearly arrived before she had. "We are full," she said, her voice clipped. "I can pay," Abigail insisted, though she did not know how. "It is not a question of payment. We do not rent rooms to unescorted ladies. A woman needs a husband, or a father, or some male protector to vouch for her. It is for the good of my establishment's reputation." The door closed with a firm, final click. As if on cue, the wind, which had been a steady, sighing presence all day, began to rise. It came in sudden, violent gusts, lifting the dust from the street in thick, choking clouds. The sky, which had been clear, was now blotted out by a rolling, brown haze. A dust storm was coming. One by one, the doors and windows of Willow Ridge were shuttered. The saloon went quiet. The lights in the general store were extinguished. The town was closing in on itself, battening down the hatches against the coming blow, leaving her outside. Abigail stood alone in the middle of the main street, the wind tearing at her shawl, whipping her hair across her face, the grit stinging her eyes. The world had been reduced to a maelstrom of dust and wind and the terrifying, overwhelming reality of her own solitude, just as a wave of true, bone-deep despair threatened to pull her under. A shape materialized out of the swirling dust. It was the rancher from the station, the one with the quiet hands and the stormy eyes. He led his team of horses, who stood patiently, their heads lowered against the wind. He stopped his wagon beside her. He did not offer platitudes or ask questions she could not answer. He simply held out a heavy canvas coat and a canteen. "The nights get cold," he said, his voice a low, steady sound beneath the shriek of the wind. He looked at her, his gaze direct and strangely comforting. No one should fall just because some other fool broke his word. Abigail's first instinct, born of a lifetime of fierce, lonely pride, was to refuse. She had never taken charity, and she would not start now. "I am fine," she said, the words nearly stolen from her lips by the wind. He did not argue. He simply continued to hold out the coat. "It is not charity," he said, as if reading her mind. "It is a coat. The wind has teeth tonight." The truth of his words was undeniable. A deep chill was already settling into her bones. She was a practical woman. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. With a curt, reluctant nod, she took the coat. It was heavy and smelled of leather, clean earth, and something else, something uniquely his. She slipped it on over her dress. It was far too large, but it was warm, a shield against the biting wind. She took the canteen as well. "Thank you," she managed to say. He gave a single, brief nod, then climbed onto the seat of his buckboard. "Good night, Miss Hollis," he said, and with a soft click of the reins, he and his wagon were swallowed by the storm. Abigail stood there for a long time, wrapped in a stranger's coat, the weight of it a small, solid comfort in a world that had dissolved into chaos. The dust storm raged around her, but inside its howling fury, a single, tiny seed had been planted. It was not hope, not yet. It was something harder, something more resilient. It was respect, given and received in a moment of shared hardship. By the time the wind began to die down in the hours before dawn, the story was complete. It had traveled on the gusts of the storm, whispered from behind closed doors and curtained windows. The tale of the mail-order bride, the jilted woman left penniless and alone on the station platform, was now the common property of Willow Ridge. Abigail May Hollis had an identity in this town now. She was the woman who had been betrayed. Her conflict was no longer with a single faithless man. It was with all of them. The first light of dawn was a weak, gray thing, filtering through a sky still thick with settling dust. The wind had exhausted itself, leaving a profound and ringing silence in its wake. Abigail May Hollis awoke to the ache of cold in her bones. She had found a sliver of shelter in the town's livery, huddled in an empty stall on a pile of straw that smelled of horses and dry hay. She was coated in a fine layer of dust, a ghost of a woman in a borrowed coat. As the town slowly stirred, a buckboard wagon rattled to a stop outside. It was him. Jonah Flint. He did not seem surprised to find her there. His expression was as steady and unreadable as it had been the night before. "The storm has passed," he said. It was a statement of fact, not an opening for conversation. "So it has," she replied, her voice hoarse. She got to her feet, brushing straw from her dress, the motion stiff with cold and pride. She began to shrug off his coat. "Keep it on," he said. "You will need it." He paused, his gaze taking in her trunk, her dusty appearance, her solitary state. "There is no room for you in town." "You have seen that for yourself." She said nothing, simply waiting. She would not ask for help. She would not beg. "My ranch is 5 miles out," he continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "I have an annex off the main bunkhouse. It is small, but it is dry and warm. My cook, a widow named Ruthie, lives in the main house. She will see to propriety." He was not offering pity. He was presenting a solution, as one might solve a problem of logistics. "You can stay there, for now." She looked at him, searching his face for any hint of ulterior motive, any sign of the leering curiosity she had seen in the other men's eyes. She found none. There was only a quiet gravity, a sense of a man who did what he thought was right, without fanfare. And in return she asked, her voice sharp, "I do not accept charity, Mr. Flint." A flicker of something that might have been approval crossed his face. "I would not expect you to. You can work for your keep. There are always things that need mending. Grain sacks, harnesses, the men's clothes. You are a seamstress, are you not? And there are other chores. The work is hard. But it is honest. He looked at her squarely. I will pay you a fair wage for any work done beyond what covers your room and board. The money will be your own, to do with as you see fit. It was more than she could have hoped for. A roof, a purpose, and most importantly, a path to her own independence. You have terms, I imagine, she said. I do, he answered, his voice firm. 3 of them. First, you will incur no debts in my name. What you need, you will earn. Second, the main house is my own. The lockbox in my office is not to be touched. Third, you will stay clear of the bullpens during breeding season. It is for your own safety. He held her gaze. Agree to those terms, and the arrangement stands. She considered them. They were clear, practical, and impersonal. They were the rules of a world she was beginning to understand, a world built on boundaries and self-reliance. I agree, she said, without another word. He lifted her heavy trunk and loaded it onto the back of the wagon as if it weighed nothing. He helped her up to the seat, his hand briefly touching hers. His grip was strong and calloused, the hand of a man who worked. Then he took his place beside her, and they rode out of Willow Ridge as the sun finally broke free of the dusty horizon, casting long shadows behind them. The Willow Creek Ranch was not a place of beauty, but of stark, functional purpose. A long, low ranch house stood on a slight rise, flanked by a sprawling barn, a series of corrals, and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. The air smelled of cattle, wood smoke, and the clean, sharp scent of pine from the distant hills. Jonah led her to the annex. It was a single room, attached to the end of the bunkhouse, but with its own door. Inside, it was spare, but clean. There was a narrow bed with a patched quilt, a small table and chair, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. A single window looked out over the corrals. It was a fortress of solitude. Ruthie will bring you some breakfast, he said from the doorway. The work can wait until you have settled. He turned to leave. Mr. Flint, she called out. He stopped, looking back at her. Why? He seemed to consider the question for a moment. My wife died 2 years ago, he said, his voice quiet. She came here from the east, same as you. This land was hard on her. It is hard on everyone, but no one should have to face it alone from the very start. He did not wait for a reply. He simply walked away, his long strides eating up the ground. Abigail's new life began before the sun was fully up the next morning, announced by the furious crowing of a rooster just outside her window. The sound was so aggressive, so full of self-importance, that she sat bolt upright in bed. You wake up like a common swindler, she muttered to the unseen bird. A sharp rap on her door was followed by the entrance of a woman who seemed to be made of hickory and sinew. She was older, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. This was Ruthie. Sun is up. Cows are waiting, the woman said, her voice as dry as the summer grass. And here, only the cattle are allowed to complain. People work. She tossed a bundle of clothes onto the bed. A dress is no good for mucking out a stall. Put these on. Abigail learned the rhythm of the ranch through the language of her own body. She learned the ache in the shoulders that came from hauling buckets of water, the burn in the thighs from squatting to milk a stubborn cow, the sting of lye soap on hands that were quickly losing their softness. Her fingers, once nimble with a needle and thread, grew stiff and sore. She spent her afternoons in the barn's tack room, the air thick with the rich, oily smell of leather, mending saddle blankets and stitching tears in heavy canvas feed bags. The ranch hands, a rough collection of men who lived by their own code, treated her with a wary, watchful distance. Jonah had clearly set the rules, and no one crossed them. They saw that she worked as hard as any of them, that she did not complain, and a slow, unspoken respect began to form. They would leave a freshly sharpened awl on her workbench or a cup of hot coffee when the mornings were especially cold. Jonah himself remained a distant figure. He was the first one up in the morning and the last one to bed at night. His days were a blur of motion riding the fence lines, breaking a new colt, directing the complex, dusty ballet of a cattle roundup. Abigail saw him mostly at a distance, a silhouette on a horse against the vast sky, at meals, which she took in the cookhouse with Ruthie. He would sometimes appear, eating quickly and silently, his mind clearly on the 100 other things that demanded his attention. One evening, as she was replacing a worn strap on a bridle, he came into the tack room. He watched her work for a moment, her hands now surprisingly adept with the tough leather. "You learn fast," he observed. "I had to," she replied, not looking up from her work. He placed a small stack of coins on the bench beside her. "Your wages for the week." She stopped her stitching and looked at the money. It was more than she had ever earned in a week of sewing fine dresses back east. It was the first money that was truly hers in this new land. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. As he turned to leave, the lamplight caught the side of his face, illuminating a thin, white scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw. It was an old wound, long healed, but it spoke of a past filled with a violence she could only imagine. He saw her looking, and his expression tightened, a shudder coming down over his eyes. He left without another word. Later that night, in the quiet solitude of his house, Jonah sat at his desk, the ranch's account books open before him, but he was not looking at the numbers. His fingers traced the faint line of the scar on his cheek, a reminder of a skirmish on the plains, escorting a wagon train of settlers through hostile territory, a lifetime ago. He opened a drawer and took out a small, oval-framed photograph. It was a picture of a young woman with a gentle smile and hopeful eyes. Elise, his Elise. She had died in this house, in a fever that had taken both her and their newborn son. He kept the photograph hidden. The past was a place he did not allow himself to visit often. It was a country full of ghosts. He looked at the picture, at the ghost of a love he had thought would last forever, and felt the familiar, hollow ache of its absence. Then he put it away, closed the drawer, and was once again Jonah Flint, owner of the Willow Creek Ranch, a man who had no time for ghosts. A few days later, a visitor arrived at the ranch. A buggy, far too fancy for the dusty landscape, pulled up in front of the main house. Barlow Finch climbed out, his large frame impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. He moved with the easy arrogance of a man accustomed to owning whatever he saw. Jonah met him on the porch. "Flint," Finch said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I hear you have acquired some new help." "I hired a seamstress," Jonah replied, his voice level. "So I have heard. The little mail-order bride who was left at the station. A sad story." Finch took a cigar from his pocket. "I have a proposition for you. I need a new girl to serve drinks and keep the customers happy at the saloon. I will buy her contract from you. Name your price." Jonah's posture did not change, but a cold stillness settled over him. "She is not for sale," he said. Finch laughed, a low, unpleasant sound. "Come now. Flint, everything is for sale. She is just a piece of unfortunate baggage. Let me take her off your hands. It would be a mutually beneficial arrangement." "The arrangement I have is the only one there will be," Jonah said, his voice flat and final. "She is under my protection. You are not welcome here. Finch, not now, not ever." For a moment, the two men stood in silent opposition, a clash of wills as palpable as a physical force. Finch's smile finally faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "You are making a mistake." "Flint," he said, then turned, climbed back into his buggy, and rode away in a cloud of dust. Abigail had seen the exchange from the cookhouse window. She did not know what was said, but she knew the meaning of Finch's predatory smile and Jonah's immovable stance. He had stood between her and the world once again. The next afternoon, during a lull in her work, she took a small, hardy rhizome she had found wrapped in damp cloth at the bottom of her trunk. It was a piece of an iris, a flower her mother had loved. She found a spot near the horse trough, where the ground was not quite so parched from the occasional splash of water. with a trowel borrowed from the tool shed. She dug a small hole and carefully planted it. She was tamping the earth around it when Jonah rode up, dismounting by the trough to let his horse drink. He watched her for a moment. "It will not survive here," he said. "The sun is too hot, the water too scarce." Abigail did not look at him. She gently watered the spot from a dipper. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but my mother used to say that any color can live, as long as it gets just one drop of coolness to remind it what it is fighting for." He stood there a moment longer, a strange expression on his face. He looked at the small patch of disturbed earth, then at the determined set of her jaw. He said nothing more, but when she returned to the tack room, she found a new pair of leather work gloves sitting on her bench. They were smaller than a man's, but sturdy and well made. They fit her hands perfectly. The drought did not break. It tightened its grip, a slow, merciless strangulation of the land. The sun rose each day not as a promise of light, but as a brassy, malevolent eye in a hazy sky. The grasses on the plains cured to the color of old bone, and the earth, once a rich, dark loam, became a web of deep, thirsty cracks. The water level in the wells at Willow Creek dropped daily, and the cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like the hoops on a barrel. They stood listlessly in the heat, their heads low, their tongues sometimes hanging from their mouths, a disturbing, unnatural blue. Jonah's face, already weathered, seemed to take on the texture of the parched land itself. The lines around his eyes deepened. He rode farther each day in search of adequate grazing, and returned each evening covered in a film of dust. A silent tension coiled in his shoulders. Nature had ceased to be a backdrop. It had become an active, formidable enemy. The town of Willow Ridge, too, was suffering. Tempers grew short as the heat intensified, and in the white church with the modest steeple, Deacon Abel Crow found a focus for the community's simmering anxiety. His Sunday sermons, once dry recitations of Scripture, took on a new fire. He spoke of moral droughts that mirrored the physical one, of impurities that could invite divine displeasure. He never used Abigail's name, but no one in the congregation doubted who he meant when he thundered about a woman of uncertain virtue living unchaperoned in a camp of men, or the serpent brought into the garden, whose presence taints the wellsprings of decency. The words, sanctified by the pulpit, became whispers in the general store, then open speculation at the saloon. The looks Abigail received on her infrequent trips to town for supplies with Ruthie became colder, more openly judgmental. She was no longer just the jilted mail-order bride. She was a blight, a potential source of the land's misfortune. The social fissure that had opened on her first day had now widened into a chasm. Barlow Finch was a man who knew how to profit from the misfortunes of others. He saw the drought not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. He had bought up vast quantities of hay from greener territories weeks before, and now, as the ranchers of Willow Ridge grew desperate, he began to sell it at a price that was nothing short of extortion. He approached Jonah one afternoon, finding him by the nearly dry creek bed. "Your herd looks thirsty." "Flint?" Finch said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "It is a shame to lose good stock. I could sell you enough hay to see you through. Of course, the price is high, but there is another way. Sell me your spring calves. Sell them to me now, at a discount, and you will have enough cash to save the rest of the herd. Cut your losses." It was an economic garrote designed to squeeze Jonah, to force him to sacrifice his future for the present. "I am not selling," Jonah said, his voice as hard and dry as the river stones at his feet. "Pride is a poor feed for starving cattle," Finch countered with a smirk. "The offer stands. For now." The pressure was immense. Coming from the sky, from the town, from the market. It was in this crucible that Abigail's resolve hardened. She would not be a burden. She would not be a victim. That evening, she approached Jonah as he was cleaning his rifle on the porch. In her hand, she held a piece of paper and the coins he had paid her. "This is for my room and board to date," she said, placing the money on the railing. "And this is a contract." He stopped his work and looked at the paper she held out. "It is a simple agreement of employment," she explained, her voice steady. "It outlines my duties and my wages. It states that I am your employee, and nothing more. I would like it to be signed, with Ruthie as a witness." Jonah looked from the paper to her face. He understood immediately. This was not about wages. This was about her name, her honor. It was a shield she was forging for herself against the poison of the town's gossip. It was a declaration that she stood on her own 2 feet, beholden to no one for charity. He took the paper from her. His eyes scanned the neatly written lines of her careful script. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Ruthie," he called out. When the cook appeared, he took the pen Abigail offered and signed his name at the bottom of the page without reading a single word of the contract she had so carefully drafted. He handed the pen to Ruthie, who added her own spiky signature as a witness. The trust in his simple act of signing without reading was a thing so profound it left Abigail momentarily speechless. He was not just giving her a job, he was giving her his faith. That night, the work was late. A saddle, its main cinch frayed, needed to be repaired before the morning roundup. They worked together in the tack room, the air warm and close, smelling of leather and pine tar. The only light came from a single lantern that cast their shadows, large and flickering, on the walls. They worked in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the scrape of the awl and the whisper of waxed thread being pulled tight. As Abigail held the heavy leather steady, Jonah applied a coat of hot, sticky resin to the new stitching. In the tight space, his hand brushed against hers. The resin, warm and tacky, created a momentary bond between their skin. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. It was a touch devoid of romance, a simple, accidental contact born of shared labor. Yet it was more intimate than any embrace. She was acutely aware of the rough texture of his calluses, the latent strength in his fingers. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He stared down at the saddle, his face cloaked in shadow. "If you do not want to hurt anyone," he said, his voice a low murmur, almost to himself, "sometimes you have to stand at a distance." The words hung in the quiet air, a glimpse into the walled-off fortress of his grief. He was not speaking to her. Not really. He was speaking to the ghost of his wife. Abigail felt a pang of understanding so sharp it was almost painful. She knew about standing at a distance. It had been the central principle of her entire life. She looked at his averted face, at the rigid line of his shoulders, and her own carefully constructed walls trembled. "Then do not let me stand alone," she whispered, the words a plea not for protection, but for partnership. He slowly turned his head and looked at her, truly looked at her, and in the warm lantern light, she saw the depth of the sorrow in his eyes. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The moment passed. The fragile connection severed as he returned to his work, but something had changed. The space between them was no longer empty. With the small amount of money she saved, Abigail pursued the one thing she felt she had any control over: justice. She wrote a letter to the postmaster in the town in Kansas that the Western Matrimonials Agency had listed as its address. She enclosed a few coins and a simple request a copy of their business registration. The reply, when it came weeks later, was a single sheet of paper stating that no such business had ever been registered. It was a ghost, an invention. But tucked into the envelope was a small, handwritten note from the postmaster. He remembered the letters, a lot of them, all going to a private box rented by a man named Silas Duffy. Silas Duffy, the drunken foreman who had delivered the letter of betrayal. The name was a key. Abigail took this new information to Sheriff Judd. She found him sitting in his office, cleaning his pistol. He listened patiently to her story, his expression weary. "It is a smart grift, I will give them that," he admitted when she had finished. "Duffy was likely just a hired hand in the scheme. The man pulling the strings is probably someone with more influence, Barlow Finch, Abigail said, the name tasting like poison. Duffy was a known associate of Finch's. The sheriff did not look surprised. Proving it is another matter. And this whole business, it is outside my jurisdiction. The fraud originated in Kansas. The money was sent from back east. To press a claim, you would have to go to the territorial capital in Helena and petition a federal judge. That takes money, ma'am, a lot of money. And a lot of time. He shook his head. My hands are tied. I am sorry. It was another door slammed shut. Another dead end. The law, which was supposed to be a shield for the innocent, was a distant, inaccessible thing. For a moment, despair washed over her, cold and bitter. But that evening, as one of the ranch hands returned from town, a new piece of information surfaced. It was a rumor, a piece of saloon gossip, but it spread through the bunkhouse like a grass fire. Evan Calder had been seen. He had not gone to Wyoming after all. He was working up at a played-out silver mine in the northern hills, a mine owned by Barlow Finch. The man who had stolen her future, who had branded her with shame, was not a distant memory. He was close. He was almost within reach. The threat was no longer an abstraction. It had a name and a face, and it was hiding just over the horizon. The smoldering embers of Abigail's anger, banked for weeks beneath a layer of quiet determination, burst into a hot, cleansing flame. The fight was not over. It had just begun. The weekend market was the thrumming, dusty heart of Willow Ridge. Wagons, buckboards, and saddle horses lined the main street, and the air was a thick brew of smells horsehide. Fresh bread from the hotel kitchen, the sharp tang of metal from the blacksmith's forge, and the overarching scent of dust and humanity. It was a day of commerce and, more importantly, a day of talk, when the isolated lives of ranchers and townsfolk converged in a noisy, swirling eddy of gossip and news. Abigail and Ruthie moved through the crowd, their purpose strictly practical. They needed salt, coffee, and a new blade for a scythe. Abigail kept her eyes down, focusing on the list in her hand, trying to make herself as small as possible. But she could feel the glances, the way conversations paused as she passed and resumed in whispers behind her back. She was a known quantity now, a story that people told. They found themselves near the general store, where Barlow Finch stood holding court, his expensive suit a dark blot against the sun-bleached landscape. Beside him, Deacon Abel Crow nodded along to Finch's pronouncements, his face a mask of pious agreement. The two men represented the twin pillars of power in the town, money and morality, and both were set against her. "It is a blight upon us," Crow was saying, his voice just loud enough to carry when the moral foundations of a community are allowed to crumble. "We cannot be surprised when the very heavens withhold their blessing." He looked pointedly at the cloudless, brassy sky. Finch chuckled, a low, confident sound. "The foundations are sound. Deacon, we just need to sweep the dirt out of the house." His eyes met Abigail's across the crowded street, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Before Abigail could react, a new sound cut through the market's din. It was the loud, affected laughter of a woman, followed by the arrogant drawl of a man. A path seemed to open in the crowd, and through it came Evan Calder. He was not the man from his letters. The humble, hard-working rancher she had imagined was gone, replaced by a man in a new suit of clothes, his hair slicked with pomade, a silver flask peeking from his coat pocket. On his arm was a saloon singer Abigail recognized as Lola Ray, a woman whose beauty was as hard and bright as polished glass. She was draped in a dress of garish red satin, a splash of vulgar color in the muted tones of the town. Evan saw Abigail, and his stride did not falter. He smirked, a look of smug triumph on his face. He stopped directly in front of her, making a public spectacle of the encounter. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look what the wind blew in. I thought you would have been long gone by now." Lola Ray looked Abigail up and down. her painted lips curling in a sneer. Is this her, Evan? The little charity case from the East. Abigail's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears, the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her skin. This is her, Evan confirmed, his voice full of mock pity. Came all this way for nothing. It is a shame, really. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single coin, a nickel. He tossed it into the dirt at Abigail's feet. Here, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. For your trouble. I found that what I was looking for could be had much cheaper, and with a good deal more enthusiasm. The insult, so public, so vile, was meant to break her. It was meant to shatter what little dignity she had left and drive her from this town forever. The crowd murmured, a mixture of shock and cruel amusement. She saw Finch smile, saw Crow nod his solemn approval. This was her final, public execution. For a long second, Abigail did nothing. She looked at the coin glinting in the dust. She felt the weight of her entire life, a life of being unwanted, of being discarded, pressing down on her. She could feel the hot sting of tears behind her eyes. But then she thought of Jonah Flint signing her contract without reading it. She thought of the small iris she had planted by the trough, a tiny, stubborn speck of color in a world of brown. She felt something inside her, a core of cold, hard rage, finally break free. She did not bend to pick up the coin. Instead, she slowly, deliberately, reached into her own pocket. She pulled out the creased, dirty letter he had sent, the one that had broken her life in two. She held it up for a moment. Then she let it fall to the ground, a piece of trash to lie beside his coin. She lifted her chin and looked directly into Evan Calder's surprised eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and sharp as breaking glass, and it cut through the noise of the market, creating a sudden, ringing silence. You are a thief and a coward. Evan Calder, she said, but you are a clumsy one. You and your associate, Silas Duffy, and the fiction you call the Western Matrimonials Agency. I have already sent for the legal papers from Kansas. I am filing a federal claim in Helena for fraud. I will not stop until I have my money back, and every man involved in this scheme, including the one who hides you in his mines, is exposed for what he is. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not the reaction of a broken victim. This was the declaration of a fighter. Evan's smug expression dissolved into a look of panicked disbelief. Lola Ray took a half-step back from him. Barlow Finch stepped forward, his face a thundercloud. This is an outrage, he boomed, his voice full of manufactured indignation. This woman is a public nuisance. She comes to our town under false pretenses, lives in a scandalous arrangement. And now she makes baseless accusations against honest men. She is a poison in our community, Sheriff. I demand that you escort this woman to the town line and see that she does not return. Deacon Crow stepped up beside him, his hands clasped as if in prayer. Mr. Finch is correct. Her presence here is a moral affliction. For the spiritual health of Willow Ridge, she must be expelled. Sheriff Judd, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, shifted uncomfortably. He looked at Finch, then at Abigail. He was a man caught between the town's most powerful citizen and a woman who, against all odds, was refusing to be broken. He looked uncertain, his authority wavering. The crowd held its breath. This was the moment. Her fate hung in the balance, to be decided by the will of two powerful men and the inaction of the law. And then, a new figure entered the circle. Jonah Flint had been standing by his wagon, listening. He now moved forward, his steps unhurried, his presence a solid, unshakable thing. He did not look at Finch or Crow or Evan. He looked only at Abigail. He stopped beside her, a silent, powerful statement of allegiance. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the entire crowd. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it had a quality of command that made every single person strain to hear it. She was betrayed by her mail-order groom, he said, his words clear and deliberate. So the rancher next door offered his name instead. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the full weight of their meaning settle over the stunned silence of the main street. He then looked directly at Barlow Finch. She is under my roof, and she will be under my name, if need be. She is not going anywhere. The challenge was absolute. It was a line drawn in the dust, a gauntlet thrown down. Finch's face turned a mottled shade of red, but he said nothing. To challenge Jonah Flint was not something a man did lightly. In the stunned aftermath, Jonah turned to Abigail. His face was unreadable, his voice low. For her alone, this gossip will not stop. He said, "They will twist this too. There is only one way to silence them for good." He took a breath. "We could get married, a legal arrangement, nothing more, a marriage of convenience, on paper, to give you the protection of my name until this business is settled. You would be your own woman, always. It is your choice." Abigail stared at him, her mind reeling. He was offering her the one thing she had never had, an unbreachable shield. He was offering her his own honor to protect hers. She looked from his steady, serious face to the hostile eyes of the crowd, to the sneering face of Finch, to the memory of the boarding house door closing in her face. She saw the long, lonely, impossible road she would have to walk by herself. And then she looked back at him. "Your name is not an umbrella, Mr. Flint," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "It is a promise. I accept, until this is made right." From behind them, a dry, cynical voice cut through the tension. "Well, this ought to be interesting," Ruthie muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Being married without touching, that is a trick harder than cooking beans without salt." A small, choked sound escaped Abigail's lips. It was half a sob, half a laugh. She looked at Ruthie's grim, impassive face, and the absurdity, the sheer, impossible strangeness of the situation broke through her shock. She laughed, a genuine laugh, right there in the middle of the main street, with the tears finally streaming down her cheeks. The wedding, if one could call it that, took place 10 minutes later in Sheriff Judd's dusty office. There was no ceremony, no flowers, no blessing. It was a legal transaction. The sheriff, looking bewildered, read the pertinent lines from a tattered law book. Jonah and Abigail stood before his desk, with Ruthie and the sheriff as the two required witnesses. When it came time for a ring, Jonah hesitated for only a second. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coil of thin, braided silver wire, a leader he used for fishing in the mountain streams, with his strong, deft fingers. He quickly worked the wire, fashioning it into a simple, shining loop. He slid it onto her finger. It was cool against her skin, a light, almost weightless circle of silver. "By the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory," Sheriff Judd mumbled, "I now pronounce you man and wife." They walked out of the office and onto the boardwalk. And then a strange and wonderful thing happened. A single, fat drop of rain hit the dusty planking. Then another and another. A soft, gentle rain began to fall from the high, gray sky. The long drought was breaking. The smell of the rain hitting the parched earth was the smell of life itself. People looked up, their faces a mixture of disbelief and joy. The market began to break up, people hurrying to get home before the real downpour began. Jonah and Abigail stood under the narrow overhang of the sheriff's office. Watching the rain, they did not speak. They did not touch. They simply stood side by side, their shoulders almost brushing, their warm breath misting in the cool, rain-washed air. The silver ring on her finger caught the gray light. Their relationship, which had been one of employer and employee, of protector and protected, had been irrevocably changed. They were now husband and wife in the eyes of the law. They were a public alliance. A new and uncertain chapter of their lives had just begun, born of betrayal and desperation, and sealed by a quiet promise in a dusty office as the heavens finally opened up and wept. The marriage was a ghost that lived between them. By day, they were partners in the relentless work of the ranch. by night. They were strangers separated by a wall of respect as solid and unbreachable as the logs of the house itself. Abigail moved her belongings from the annex into a small spare room in the main house, a room that had once been a nursery and whose window looked out onto the vast, empty plains. Jonah remained in his own room at the far end of the hall. The space between their closed doors at night was a chasm of unspoken words and careful distances. But a shared life, even one born of necessity, demands a practical intimacy. They began to share the ranch's ledger, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, the lantern casting a warm circle of light around them. Her neat, precise script filled the columns next to his rough, blocky figures. She learned the cost of winter feed and the market price for a healthy steer. He learned that her mind for numbers was as sharp and quick as her needle. They rode out together in the pre-dawn chill to drive a small herd of stray calves back from the high country, riding side by side, their horses moving in easy rhythm. The shared silence was not awkward, but companionable, forged in the common language of hard work. In these quiet moments, the carefully constructed walls began to show small cracks. One evening, as a cool breeze whispered through the open kitchen window, she spoke of her childhood. She did not speak of it with self-pity, but with the flat, factual tone of a survivor. The orphanage was a place of rules, not affection, she said, her eyes on the mending in her lap. We were taught to be useful, to be quiet, and to expect nothing that we had not earned. A name was just a label on a cot. A family was a concept from a storybook. Jonah listened, his hands busy oiling a piece of leather. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low, the words scraped from a place of deep, guarded pain. I had a son, he said, his gaze fixed on the dark window pane. We named him Samuel. He had his mother's smile. He paused, and the silence in the room was heavy with the weight of what was coming. Elise, my wife. She never recovered from the birth. A fever took hold. Then the diphtheria came through the valley. It took the boy in a single night. He was 6 months old. Elise followed him a week later. He set the piece of leather down, his movements stiff. This ranch is all I have left of them. Just the work. The work is real. He did not look at her. He simply got up and walked out onto the porch, leaving her alone in the lamplight with the ghosts he had just released into the room. She now understood the source of his stillness, the reason for the distance he kept. He was not just a widower. He was a man hollowed out by loss. While a fragile trust grew at the ranch, a conspiracy festered in the valley. Barlow Finch had not forgotten his public humiliation. He saw Jonah not just as a rival, but as an obstacle to his complete control of the region, especially with the election for the head of the Cattlemen's Association approaching. He sent for Evan Calder. He found him in a shack near the mine, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey. Your little mail-order bride is causing a great deal of trouble, Finch began, his tone smooth as poison. She has made you look like a fool, and now, by marrying Flint, she has made him look like a saint. Evan scowled. What do you want from me? Finch placed a leather-bound journal and a small, heavy pouch on the rickety table. I want the truth, he said with a knowing smile. I want you to write down the story of your arrangement, how she pursued you, how she made promises she could not keep, how her character was not what it seemed. A story of a good man lured into a regrettable situation by a desperate woman. Write it down, sign it, and this pouch of gold is yours. It will be enough to get you to California, or anywhere else you want to disappear to. Finch's plan was simple. He would use the slanderous, signed confession to destroy Abigail's reputation and, by extension, Jonah's. He would paint Jonah as a fool, a man taken in by a scheming woman, a man unfit to lead. As Finch plotted, nature unleashed its own fury. The rain that had broken the drought had been a brief respite. Now the heat returned, drier and more dangerous than before. The new grass that had sprouted was tinder dry. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled in. A dark, bruised mass of clouds that brought more lightning than rain. A single, jagged bolt of white fire struck a ridge to the south of the ranch. Within minutes, a plume of smoke was visible against the sky, and the wind, hot and strong, was pushing a wall of orange flame directly toward the Willow Creek grazing lands. The cry of fire was a jolt of pure adrenaline. There was no panic, only a grim, focused urgency. Jonah was in command, his voice sharp and clear, his orders precise. He led a team of ranch hands to ride ahead of the fire, setting a backburn, a controlled line of fire that would consume the fuel in the path of the main blaze. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. Abigail, without being asked, knew what she had to do. She harnessed a team to the water wagon, her hands moving with a speed and confidence that would have surprised the woman who had stepped off the train weeks before. She drove the heavy wagon back and forth from the well to the fire line, her face smudged with soot, her eyes burning from the smoke. She brought water for the men, soaked burlap sacks for them to beat at the stray embers that jumped the firebreak. She was no longer an outsider, a seamstress playing at being a ranch woman. She was part of the line, a vital link in the chain of survival. The fire did not distinguish between man and woman, between owner and employee. It demanded only strength and courage, and she found she had both. They fought the fire through the night, a small, determined army against a roaring, monstrous beast. By dawn, they had won. A wide, blackened scar separated the ranch from the still smoldering hills. The danger had passed. They were exhausted, soot-stained, and bone-weary, but they were safe. The shared victory, the trial by fire, had forged a new kind of bond between Abigail and the men of the ranch. They looked at her differently now, with a respect that had nothing to do with her being the boss's wife. She had earned her place. But inside Abigail, a new and more complicated conflict was smoldering. As she looked at Jonah, his face grimy, his shirt singed, she felt a wave of something so powerful it frightened her. It was a tangle of gratitude, admiration, and a deep, aching tenderness. He had saved her, given her his name, and now he had fought beside her to save their home. She felt she owed him everything, and that was the problem. Was this feeling love, or was it just the deep, clinging debt of the rescued? She looked at the silver ring on her finger and thought of the ghost of Elise, the woman with the gentle smile. She could not, would not, be a replacement, a shadow living in another woman's house, another woman's marriage. That evening, the exhaustion was too deep for words. The men collapsed in the bunkhouse, in the main house. Abigail found Jonah on the porch, staring into the darkness where the fire had been. He had a nasty set of blisters on his hands from his shovel. She came out with a bowl of cool water and a tin of salve. "Let me see," she said, her voice soft. He did not protest. He held out his hands, and she gently began to clean the raw, blistered skin. He was so still, his breathing the only sound between them. As she wrapped a clean strip of linen around his palm, her fingers brushed against the old, white scar on his temple. He flinched, an involuntary tremor that ran through his entire body. It was as if her touch had found the one place that was not numb with exhaustion, the one place where the pain of the past was still raw. She paused, her hands still on his, the silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. She had to know. She had to take a risk as great as fighting the fire. "If I said I wanted to stay," she whispered, her heart pounding, and not just for safety. He did not pull away. He slowly lifted his head and met her eyes. The weariness in his face was immense, but for the first time, she saw something else there, something vulnerable and uncertain. "Then I would listen," he said, his voice raspy with smoke and emotion. "I would listen until you had said enough." It was not a declaration of love, but it was a beginning. It was the opening of a door that had been bolted shut for 2 long years. The next day's mail brought 2 letters that would fan the embers of their conflict back into a full blaze. The first was the official reply from the territorial office in Helena. It confirmed what the Kansas postmaster had suspected the Western Matrimonials Agency was not, and had never been, a legally registered business. The seal on their documents, the letter noted, was a forgery, and the signature most often associated with their correspondence belonged to one Silas Duffy. The legal bullet she needed was now in her hand, clean and ready. The second letter was for Ruthie, from a friend in town. It contained a warning. Deacon Crow, enraged by what he called the public spectacle of sin at the market, had drafted a petition. He was circulating it among his congregation and the other decent folk of Willow Ridge. The petition demanded the legal expulsion of Abigail May Flint from the community on grounds of moral turpitude. Ruthie read the letter, her lips tightening into a thin, grim line. She snorted. Moral turpitude. She scoffed, slamming a pot down on the stove. That old goat, I will give him moral turpitude. I will tell his flock that the wife of Jonah Flint has kept the vows of her marriage bed better and more honorably than half the women who signed that blasted paper. The battle lines were being drawn. The slow, simmering tensions of the past weeks were about to boil over. On one side stood the law, the evidence, and a fragile, burgeoning love. On the other stood the power of money, the poison of slander, and the cold, unyielding fist of self-righteous morality. The fire on the ridge was out, but a new, more dangerous fire was about to be lit in the heart of Willow Ridge. The town hall was not a court of law, but that night, it felt like one. The air was thick with the heat of too many bodies packed into a small space, and the acrid smell of oil lamps turned up high. It was a community hearing, a piece of frontier democracy that could be as swift and unforgiving as a prairie fire. Barlow Finch and his allies sat on one side of the room, a solid, confident block of vested interests. Deacon Crow sat with them, his Bible resting on his lap like a weapon. On the other side sat Abigail, Jonah, and Ruthie, an island of three in a sea of hostile or uncertain faces. Sheriff Judd, looking deeply uncomfortable in his role as moderator, called the meeting to order. The pretense was to discuss Deacon Crow's petition for the expulsion of an undesirable element. The reality was a trial, with Abigail as the sole defendant. Crow was the first to speak. He rose, his tall, gaunt frame casting a long shadow on the wall. He did not speak of Abigail directly, but of the sacredness of the family, the sanctity of the community, and the subtle ways in which moral decay could invite God's wrath. He spoke of the drought and the fire, weaving them into a narrative of spiritual failing, with an unnamed source of corruption at its center. It was a masterful performance, turning fear and superstition into a verdict. Then Barlow Finch called his star witness. Evan Calder walked to the front of the room, holding the leather-bound journal Finch had given him. He looked not at Abigail, but at the faces of the townsfolk, casting himself as the victim. He read from the journal in a voice thick with false sincerity. He told a story of a lonely rancher who had been deceived by a woman of calculating ambition. He painted a picture of Abigail as demanding and morally lax, a woman whose letters had been full of an unseemly forwardness. He claimed she had misrepresented herself, and that when he discovered her true character upon her arrival, he had honorably broken the engagement to protect his own good name. It was a tapestry of lies, each one designed to assassinate her character and validate his own despicable actions. When he was finished, a low murmur of approval went through Finch's side of the room. Finch himself looked smug, confident in his victory. Sheriff Judd looked at Abigail. "Ma'am," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Abigail rose from her chair. She did not look angry or defeated. Her face was calm, her posture erect. In her hands, she held not a journal of lies, but a small, neat stack of papers. She walked to the front of the room and placed them on the table before the sheriff. "I do not have a story," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the packed hall. "I have facts." She picked up the first paper. "This is a letter from the territorial office in Helena. It certifies that the Western Matrimonials Agency is a fraudulent enterprise with no legal registration. She set it down and picked up another. This is a copy of my bank draft, showing the transfer of my life savings to that agency. And this, she said, holding up a third document, is a sworn statement from the postmaster in Kansas, confirming that the agency's mail was collected by Mr. Silas Duffy. She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room, landing for a moment on Finch, a man known to be in the employ of Mr. Barlow Finch. A different kind of murmur now spread through the crowd. This was not gossip. It was evidence. The tide of opinion, which had been running so strongly against her, began to hesitate, to turn. And finally, Abigail said, her voice dropping, there is the matter of character. She looked directly at Evan Calder. This is the letter you sent me, the one delivered by Mr. Duffy. Your signature is on it, and it says nothing of my supposed flaws. It says only that you have gone to Wyoming and are keeping my money to cover your expenses. She held it out. I would ask the sheriff to compare this signature to the one in your so-called journal. The room erupted. The carefully constructed narrative of Finch and Crow was collapsing. Hawk Roper, who had been sitting with Finch's men, his face growing darker with every word Abigail spoke, suddenly shot to his feet. She is a liar, he roared, his chair crashing backward. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched to grab her. I will shut her mouth myself. Before he had taken 2 steps, Jonah was there. He did not shout. He simply moved, a blur of deadly speed and efficiency that was shocking in its suddenness. He met Roper's charge, not with a wild swing, but with a hard, precise block that sent Roper stumbling off balance. As the bigger man recovered, Jonah struck twice, 2 short, brutal punches to the gut that drove the air from Roper's lungs in a pained whoosh. Roper doubled over, gasping, and Jonah hit him once more, a solid right hand to the jaw that sent him crashing to the floor in a heap. The hall exploded into chaos. Men from both sides surged to their feet. A fistfight broke out near the back. In the midst of the pandemonium, a deafening gunshot cracked the air. Sheriff Judd stood on his chair, a smoking pistol in his hand, his face a mask of fury. The next man who throws a punch will be spending the rest of the month in a cell. He yelled, his voice cutting through the noise. Sit down, all of you. Slowly, reluctantly, order was restored. As men returned to their seats and Roper was helped to his feet, a new voice cut through the tense, smoke-filled silence. I believe this might be of interest. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Maggie Sharp, the proprietor of the boarding house. In her arms, she held a dusty wooden crate, the kind used for shipping mail. She walked to the front of the room and set it on the table with a solid thud. One of Mr. Duffy's associates left this behind a few weeks ago. She said, her voice flat. He paid for a room, then left in a hurry. I found this under his bed. It seems to be the lost property of the Western Matrimonials Agency. She lifted the lid. The crate was filled to the brim with letters. There are dozens of them, she said, looking not at Abigail, but at the stunned faces of the town council. Letters from women in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, all of them telling the same story, all of them enclosing money, and all of them answered by letters promising a new life in Willow Ridge with a man who never appears. It was the final, devastating blow. The proof was undeniable. A box full of heartbreak and fraud. The gazes that had been fixed on Abigail now turned, hard and accusing. On Evan Calder, he crumbled. The color drained from his face, and he began to tremble. He looked at Finch, his eyes wide with panic, pleading for help, but Finch's face was a mask of cold fury. He was cutting his losses. It was not my idea, Evan cried out, his voice a high, reedy whine. Finch made me do it. He planned the whole thing, the letters, the money, the story about her. It was all him. He promised me gold. Finch did not wait to hear any more. He stood up, and in one fluid motion, he drew a pistol from inside his coat. The crowd recoiled. "Stay back," he snarled, backing toward the door. "All of you." He was almost to the entrance when he found his path blocked. Jonah stood there, having moved silently through the chaos. He did not have a gun in his hand. He was just standing there, a solid, immovable object. Finch raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at Jonah's chest. "Out of my way, Flint!" Outside, a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, the first sound of a coming storm. The street was dark, the drizzling rain turning the dust to mud. The flickering light from the town hall lamps cast long, dancing shadows. From the corner of his eye, Jonah saw Sheriff Judd moving into position, his own gun drawn. He had a clear shot at Finch. He could end it, right here, right now. He could avenge the wrong done to Abigail, the threat to his home, the corruption of his town. A part of him, a dark, cold part he had not felt since his cavalry days, wanted to, but he did not move. He held Finch's gaze, his own face calm, resolute. He would not become a killer. He would not choose vengeance over the law, no matter how flawed that law might be. He lowered his hand slightly, a clear signal to the sheriff. This was Judd's play. It was all the opening the sheriff needed. "Drop it!" Finch Judd yelled. Finch, momentarily distracted, glanced toward the sheriff. In that split second, Jonah moved, not to attack, but to slam the town hall door shut, trapping Finch outside in the muddy street with the law. A moment later, they heard a scuffle, a single gunshot that was not aimed at anyone, and then the sheriff's voice, sharp and final. "It is over." The tension in the hall broke. People surged forward, talking at once, their allegiances shifting as quickly as the wind. In the midst of the swirling chaos, Jonah turned to Abigail. The noise, the people, the drama, all of it seemed to fade away. There was only the two of them, standing in the flickering lamplight. He reached out and touched her arm, his touch gentle. "My name," he said, his voice a low whisper meant only for her. "It is not just to keep the rain off." He looked into her eyes, and she saw in them not a protector, not a stranger, but a man laying his own broken heart bare. "If you need a real roof, Abigail, I am ready to drive the posts." Before she could answer, the doors burst open again. Sheriff Judd stood there, one hand holding Barlow Finch in ironclad cuffs. "Someone ride to the stagecoach station," the sheriff ordered. "Tell the agent to hold the eastbound stage. Silas Duffy is on it." It was over. The network of lies and deceit had collapsed. The town, which had been so ready to condemn her, now looked at Abigail with a new, dawning respect. She was not the victim. She was the woman who had fought back, the woman who had brought a powerful man to justice. She had won. The weeks that followed the hearing at the town hall were like the slow, steady rain that had finally returned to the valley. The world, which had been hard-edged and hostile, softened. The news from Helena arrived by stagecoach, carried in an official-looking envelope addressed to Sheriff Judd. He rode out to the ranch himself to deliver it, a gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed. He read the verdict aloud in the quiet of the ranch house kitchen, with Jonah, Abigail, and Ruthie as his audience. Barlow Finch had been sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in the territorial prison for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted bribery. His empire of intimidation had crumbled overnight. Silas Duffy, for his part, received a lesser sentence of 3 years, and Evan Calder, in exchange for his full and damning testimony against Finch, had been given a sentence of time served and was ordered to leave the Montana Territory permanently. Enclosed in the envelope was a bank draft, drawn on Finch's seized assets, for the full amount of Abigail's stolen dowry, plus damages. Justice, it turned out, was not just a distant idea in a law book. It was a tangible thing, a piece of paper that represented a life restored. The following Sunday was a day of quiet reckoning. The pews of Deacon Crow's church were full, the congregation humming with a nervous, expectant energy. Abigail and Jonah sat together, not in the back as they usually did, but in the third row, a silent, united presence. After the opening hymn, Deacon Crow did not immediately begin his sermon. He stood at the pulpit, his face pale, his hands gripping the wooden eagle carved into its front. He cleared his throat. "Before we proceed with the worship of the Lord," he began, his voice stiff, "it is my duty, as a shepherd of this flock, to acknowledge a grave error in my own judgment." He did not look at Abigail, but stared at a point on the back wall. "I allowed suspicion to cloud my Christian charity. I spoke words born of rumor rather than fact. I have wronged a member of this community. And for that, I offer my public and sincere apology to Mrs. Flint." The name came out as if it pained him, but he said it. "I asked for her forgiveness, and for the forgiveness of God." He then launched into a sermon on the sin of bearing false witness, a sermon that was as much a penance for himself as it was an instruction to his flock. Abigail's honor, which had been so viciously attacked, was now restored in the very place it had been most threatened. The social shifts did not end there. A few days later, Ruthie, in a move that scandalized the more conservative women of the town, hired a young orphaned girl named Sarah to help in the kitchen. "The girl needed work, and I need an extra pair of hands," Ruthie declared to anyone who questioned it. "It is better she learns to bake bread here than to answer some advertisement from a scoundrel in a newspaper." It was a small act, but it was a beginning, a new path being cleared. With the external battles won, the true, quiet conflict remained, the one that existed in the space between two closed bedroom doors. The legal marriage had served its purpose. It had been a shield, a fortress. But Abigail knew that a true home could not be a fortress. It had to be a sanctuary, entered into freely. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the air cool and smelling of damp earth and new grass, she finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart. "The court has returned my money." "Jonah," she said softly, twisting the silver wire ring on her finger, "my name has been cleared. The reasons for our arrangement no longer exist." Jonah stopped his whittling, his hands growing still. He looked out at the land, now turning a soft, hopeful green under the evening sky. "I know," he said. "It was a kindness I can never repay." She continued, her voice trembling slightly. "You gave me your name when I had nothing, but a marriage should not be a debt, and it should not be a defense." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the twilight. "I have grown to care for you, Jonah, more than I thought I was capable of caring for anyone. But I cannot live as your wife because I am grateful, and I cannot live in the shadow of the wife you loved and lost, if we are to have a true marriage. It must be a new beginning, a choice we both make in the clear light of day, with no ghosts and no debts between us." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the chirping of crickets in the new grass. He looked at her, his face etched with a profound, weary sadness, but also with a deep and abiding respect. "You are right, Abigail," he said, his voice quiet. "It has to be a choice, not a necessity." He set his whittling aside. "I will wait," he said, "however long it takes." The next morning, a wagon loaded with fresh-cut timber from the mountains arrived at the ranch. Jonah, with the help of his ranch hands, began to lay the foundations for a new structure. It was not an addition to the main house, but a small, perfectly proportioned cabin, set on a gentle slope overlooking the creek. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his hammer blows ringing out in the clear morning air. The sounds of construction became the new rhythm of the ranch, a rhythm of building, of creating something new and lasting. Abigail watched from the house as the walls went up. As the roofline took shape, she saw that the largest window, the one that would look out from the main room, was being framed to face east, directly toward the small, stubborn patch of irises she had planted, which were now sending up thick, green shoots. He was building her a house by choice. As the cabin neared completion, a new kind of life began to take root at the ranch. Through Sheriff Judd, Jonah had heard of two brothers, barely teenagers, whose parents had died of influenza, leaving them wards of the county. He rode into town and came back with them. They were thin and quiet, with the haunted, watchful eyes of those who have known too much loss. Abigail took them under her wing. In the room she had once occupied in the main house, she set up what she called her reading and sewing corner. She taught the boys their letters in the evenings, reading to them from an old book of poems. She showed them how to mend their own clothes, the steady, patient work of the needle a calming balm for their restless hands. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was becoming a place of healing, a family being built not by blood, but by choice. The land itself seemed to mirror this renewal. The rains came regularly now, soft, life-giving showers that turned the pastures into a carpet of deep green. The creek ran full and clear. In the birthing pens, a new crop of calves was born, their clumsy, long-legged forms a promise of the future. The natural world was in harmony, its rhythm steady and reassuring, a gentle counterpoint to the violent upheavals of the past months. One evening, Jonah found her in the new cabin. The walls smelled of fresh sawn pine and clean earth. The glass was not yet in the windows, and the cool night air drifted through the open frames, carrying the scent of the wet grass and the sound of the gurgling creek. She was standing at the large window, looking out at the darkness. She was holding her small Bible. "I found something I wanted to read to you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned and opened the book, the pages rustling in the silence. She did not need a lamp. The moonlight pouring through the window was bright enough. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you," she read, her voice soft and clear. "I have called you by your name. You are mine." She looked up from the page, her eyes meeting his. "A name is not just a label," she said. "It is a promise. It is a calling." He moved closer, stepping out of the shadows and into the pool of moonlight beside her. He looked from her face to the book in her hands, and then back to her eyes. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. It was a touch of infinite tenderness, a question asked without words. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. All the walls, all the defenses, all the carefully constructed distances simply dissolved. There were no ghosts between them now, no debts, only the quiet, profound truth of two lonely people who had found their way home. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was slow and soft and full of a reverence that spoke of all the trials they had endured. It was a kiss that tasted of rain-washed air and pine wood and the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings to come. It was a kiss that sealed not a legal contract, but a covenant of the heart. It was their first real kiss, and it was a beginning. A few days later, Sheriff Judd rode out again, this time with the final, official annulment papers for her marriage to Jonah. He found them sitting on the steps of the new, completed cabin, sharing a cup of coffee as the sun went down. "Well," the sheriff said, a wry smile touching his lips as he handed her the papers. "That is the end of that business. It is a shame I went to all the trouble of stamping that marriage certificate," he winked. "If you two decide to get married on paper again, I will have to start charging a fee for the ink." Jonah stood up and put his arm around Abigail's shoulders, a simple, natural gesture of possession and partnership. He looked at the sheriff, a rare, genuine smile lighting up his face. "Next time, Sheriff," he said, "we will not be using paper. We will carve it right into the porch beam." The season turned. The rains, which had come in a torrent of judgment and relief, softened into a rhythm of gentle, life-giving showers. The land, so long a study in browns and grays, flushed with a green so vibrant it seemed to ache with new life. Willow Creek ran full and clear, its voice a constant, happy murmur. The air was clean, washed free of dust and bitterness. They finished the cabin as the first of the prairie wildflowers began to bloom. It stood on its gentle slope, solid and true, its pine logs smelling of the forest and the sun. It was a house that had been earned, built not just with timber and nails, but with courage and trust. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, Jonah found Abigail by the creek. She was standing by the water's edge, watching the light dance on the ripples. The single patch of irises she had planted near the horse trough was now a thriving clump, and one perfect, deep purple flower had opened, its petals like velvet in the soft light. He came to stand beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the day end, listening to the music of the water and the evening song of the birds. The world felt at peace, and for the first time, so did they. Finally, he reached into his pocket. He did not speak, but simply held out his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a ring. It was the same simple loop of braided silver wire he had fashioned in the sheriff's office. But it was changed. A craftsman in a town downriver had smoothed its edges and worked it into a seamless, polished circle, and on its inner surface, in tiny, perfect script, were two words: Hollis Flint. He took her hand, his touch warm and steady, and slid the ring onto her finger. It settled into place as if it had always belonged there. "It is not," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper that seemed to be part of the evening itself. "So you can carry my name. It is so I can live in yours." She looked from the ring, shining on her finger, to his face, his beloved, weathered face, and saw in his eyes a home more real and more lasting than any building, the last of her defenses, the last of her fears, simply washed away in the gentle current of the creek. "I choose this house," she answered, her own voice soft but clear as a bell. "I choose this man. Not because I'm afraid, but because of tomorrow." Their wedding was held the following Saturday. In the yard of the ranch they had fought for together. There were no grand pronouncements, no pews full of strangers. The guests were the family they had built the ranch hands, their faces scrubbed clean, their hats held respectfully in their hands. Sheriff Judd, looking more comfortable than he ever did in his office. The two orphaned boys, standing straight and proud in new shirts Abigail had sewn, and Ruthie, presiding over a long table laden with roasted chicken, fresh baked bread, and a 3-tiered cake frosted with wild berry icing. A fiddler who worked one of the neighboring ranches played a series of sweet, simple tunes that drifted on the afternoon breeze. A traveling minister, a man with a kind face and a gentle voice, was brought in to say the words. The vows they exchanged were not from a book. They were short, simple promises spoken from the heart, promises of partnership, of loyalty, of shared sunrises and quiet evenings. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the ranch hands. And Jonah did not hesitate. He drew Abigail into his arms and kissed her, a real kiss, full of love and laughter and the promise of a lifetime, right there under the vast Montana sky. Later, as the sun set, the fiddler struck up a slow, sweet waltz. Jonah led Abigail to a patch of hard-packed earth that had been swept clean for dancing. He took her in his arms, and they began to move, a slow, easy circle under the rising stars. He was not a graceful dancer, and her steps were simple, but it did not matter. They moved as one, their foreheads resting together, their world shrinking to the small, sacred space between them. The sounds of the party faded away, and there was only the music and the dust and the solid, reassuring presence of each other. That night, they entered the new cabin together for the first time as husband and wife. A single lamp burned on the bedside table, casting a warm, golden glow on the fresh wood walls. Jonah had brought her trunk over earlier, and her few possessions were neatly arranged. Her sewing basket by the hearth, her book of poems on the small table. Through the large, open window came the cool night air, carrying the scent of the plains and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation. This was not the beginning of a life with a stranger. It was the continuation of a journey they had been on for months. He took her hands in his, his thumbs gently stroking her knuckles. They stood by the open window, looking out at the sea of stars that glittered in the immense darkness. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. She listened. She heard the wind sighing through the grass, the chirp of crickets, the murmur of the creek. "It is the sound of peace," she answered. "It is the sound of home," he corrected gently. He turned to her, his face serious in the lamplight. "I never thought I would feel this again. I never thought this house would be anything but a place of work, a place of memory." He touched the silver ring on her finger. "You brought it back to life. Abigail." She raised her hand and laid it against his cheek, feeling the familiar roughness of his skin, the faint, faded line of his scar. "We brought each other back to life," she said. They stood there, hand in hand, their whispered words weaving a new story into the fabric of the night. It was an intimacy that had nothing to do with the marriage bed and everything to do with the soul. It was the profound, unshakable knowledge that their long years of solitude were finally over. "Here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No one has to stand alone anymore." The change in their lives rippled outward, touching the town they now called home, spurred on by the revelations of the trial and the quiet, persistent lobbying of women like Maggie Sharp and Ruthie. The town council of Willow Ridge did something remarkable. They established a community fund, a small pool of money set aside to provide temporary aid and passage home for any woman who arrived in their town and found herself abandoned or deceived. Furthermore, Sheriff Judd, with the help of the postmaster, instituted a new verification process. Any male arriving for a prospective bride from a matrimonial agency would be held until the groom's identity and prospects could be confirmed by a member of the council. It was a small, local solution to a large, insidious problem. A measure of systemic justice had been born from a single woman's fight for her own honor. One afternoon, Abigail walked out to the horse trough. The iris was in full, glorious bloom, a clump of deep purple that seemed to drink in the sunlight. She knelt in the soft earth beside it and gently pushed a small, hand-carved wooden sign into the ground. On it, in letters she had carefully burned into the wood, were 3 words: "Home, by choice." As she stood up, dusting the dirt from her hands, Ruthie came out of the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the sign, then at Abigail, then at Jonah, who was coming up from the barn. She planted her hands on her hips, her expression as stern and uncompromising as ever. "Well," she declared, her voice carrying across the yard, "I suppose this means there will be one more mouth to feed at the supper table on a permanent basis." She fixed Jonah with a gimlet eye. "But do not for 1 minute think that means I will be washing your dishes for you." Jonah's face broke into a wide, easy grin. He walked over to Abigail, putting his arm around her waist and pulling her close. He looked at the formidable old woman who had been his conscience and his anchor for so long. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice full of mock solemnity and deep, genuine affection. "Whatever you say, General." A year passes in the way that time does in the West, measured not by the turning of pages in a calendar, but by the turning of the seasons. It was a good year. The spring was wet, the summer was warm, but not scorching, and the autumn arrived with a bounty that felt like a blessing. The Willow Creek Ranch thrived. The herds were fat and healthy, and the new crop of calves was the best Jonah had ever seen. The creek, which a year before had been a dry scar on the land, now ran full and clear, its voice a constant, happy murmur against the banks. The small cabin by the water was no longer new. It had settled into the landscape as if it had always been there, its pine logs weathered to a soft, silvery gray. Inside, it was a place of quiet warmth and easy comfort. The scent of Abigail's baking often mingled with the smell of Jonah's leatherwork, creating a fragrance that was uniquely their own. They were no longer just husband and wife. They were partners in every sense of the word. They ran the ranch together, their decisions made over the kitchen table, their strengths complementing each other as perfectly as 2 halves of a whole. Abigail Hollis Flint was a different woman from the one who had stepped off the train with a battered trunk, and a heart full of fragile hope. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a shaper of her own destiny and the destinies of others. The room in the main house that had once been her sewing corner had blossomed into something more. It was now known throughout the valley as the schooling and sewing room. 3 afternoons a week, the children from the surrounding ranches, including the 2 boys Jonah had taken in, would gather there. She taught them to read, to write, to cipher. She taught the girls to sew a straight seam, to mend a tear, to create something useful and beautiful with their own hands. It was a place of learning, but it was also a place of safety, a place where a child's worth was measured not by the strength of their back, but by the brightness of their mind. Jonah, too, had been transformed. The quiet, guarded man who had lived in the shadow of a profound loss had slowly, almost imperceptibly, opened up to the light. The grief for Elise and their son would always be a part of him, a gentle ache of memory. But it no longer defined him. He had learned to love again, not by replacing the past, but by building a new future. The laughter came more easily to him now, a deep, rumbling sound that Abigail had come to cherish. He still worked as hard as ever, his hands still calloused, his face still weathered by the sun and wind, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a steady, quiet joy. He was no longer just the keeper of his family's legacy. He was the co-creator of a new one. The changes on the ranch had sent ripples of change through the entire community. Ruthie, in her own gruff, no-nonsense way, had become the unlikely heart of a new social network. She was now known, with a mixture of respect and dry amusement, as the most sensible matchmaker in the territory. When a new girl arrived in town, whether she was a mail-order bride or simply a young woman seeking work, her first stop was often the Willow Creek Ranch. Ruthie would assess her situation with a shrewd eye, find her a safe place to stay, and connect her with honest employment. She had replaced the predatory, profit-driven model of the matrimonial agencies with a system built on community, compassion, and common sense. A woman's worth in Willow Ridge was no longer determined by the man who had sent for her, but by the strength of her own character and the support of the women who had come before her. The lessons of the past year had settled deep into the bones of the community. They had learned that true honor was not about reputation or public piety. It was about making the right choice in the hardest of moments. They had learned that love was not a fleeting passion, but a daily decision, a quiet commitment to stand by someone's side, come what may. They had learned that a name was not a social label to be judged or whispered about, but a living promise, a declaration of who you chose to be. And they had learned that a family was not something you were simply given, but something you built, with your own hands, with your own heart, with your own choices. One morning, just as the sun was beginning to crest the eastern hills, Abigail stepped out of the cabin. The air was cool and crisp, and the fields were veiled in a soft, silvery mist. She carried a basket of laundry, and the clean, fresh scent of lye soap mingled with the smell of the damp earth. She walked to the fence line and began to hang a series of white linen cloths to dry. One of them, a long, soft scarf, caught the breeze, its white length a bright, hopeful banner against the deep green of the pasture. From the porch of the main house, Jonah watched her. He had risen early, as he always did. But this morning he lingered, a cup of hot coffee steaming in his hands. He was not watching her as a rancher assesses a worker, but as a man beholds a miracle. He saw the strength in her back, the grace in her movements, the quiet competence that she brought to every task. He saw the woman who had faced down a town full of accusers, the woman who had fought a fire by his side, the woman who had healed his broken heart with her quiet, steadfast love. He turned, and his hand came to rest on the heavy wooden beam that supported the porch roof, carved into the wood. In letters that were rough but deep and true were their names, entwined. His fingers traced the familiar grooves, the shape of her name next to his. Just then, The first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, and a shaft of pure, golden light struck the porch beam. The carved letters seemed to shine, to catch the light and hold it, a testament in silver and gold to the life they had built. Theirs was not a fairy tale. It was a story of the West, a story written in sweat and mud and scars. But it was also a story of enduring hope. It was a story that proved that even in the harshest of landscapes, kindness could take root and love could bloom. It was a testament to the belief that no matter how betrayed you are by the world, you still have the power to decide who you will let stand beside you under your own roof. The future stretched out before them, as vast and full of promise as the Montana sky. A wide-open field waiting for them to walk it together. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.